there is his young friend, Eddie McDowell. Eddie, where are you? Eddie's there. Eddie, welcome. Eddie's a student at WICK College in Chicago. We know Jerry for 15 years. And what I would love to say to Jerry is the world-known expert on C.S. Lewis, but what you probably don't know, this would be good information, especially for Matusz Kocian, who is very, very powerful man. Where are you, Matusz? He really is in the gym quite often. That Jerry used to be football player, American football player, and Jerry is still a very strong man, but he was much stronger. A couple of years ago, he did like overhead press, 320 pounds, and in bench is your sphere. He did 400 pounds in bench, and Jerry told me when he was in my age, 20 plus years ago, he did in the age of 52, 220 pounds in bench and 100 repetition in one hour. So you can try to follow it. But it will be not. He met at the railway station 2 hours ago, and he's always taking me up. That's the way how we are welcoming each other. So it will be about C.S. Lewis. You know, C.S. Lewis died in 1963 in this very day as Kennedy, American president. Welcome, and please tell us more what C.S. Lewis would say to us if he would be alive. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm great to be here. The first time I was ever at the Narnia School was the very year the school opened. And I've spoken here, I think this is maybe my 4th time. And I'm very glad to be here and see how big the school has grown. I would like to say some things about C.S. Lewis in a moment, but I will say about the Eagle and Child Pub. I have stayed in the Eagle and Child Pub upstairs. The man who used to run it was a friend of mine, and he gave me the sign that was above the door, which is now in my basement in my home. It's so fun to come in here and see your C.S. Lewis restaurant, your Eagle and Child restaurant. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, a very rough part of Los Angeles. It was the area where the gangs began in Los Angeles. And so consequently, always in school there were fights and difficulties, and it was hard. I played American football there. You have to take that by faith. Now I'm a very old man, so it doesn't make any difference what you did when you were young. You get old and all that goes away. You find other interests. But nevertheless, I had no academic interests whatsoever. I was not a person who was a good student, but I did play sports. And I was football, athletics, track and field, and also wrestling. And so I wanted to go to college because in America, in the universities, you could still play sports. So that was my academic interest. And I went to college. I was not in any way a person of faith. I had no interest in things of faith. But when I got to college, there were some friends who talked to me about spiritual things. And I had become a Christian. After I became a Christian, I started reading for the first time in my life. I read the Bible from cover to cover. I talked to my friends about ideas, and they had questions, and I had no idea about the answer to these questions. If God's good and all-powerful, why is there evil in the world? What about other religions and all this stuff? I didn't know anything. So I started reading, and I read C.S. Lewis. And when I started reading C.S. Lewis, I was intrigued, not only because he was a man with a good mind, he had a good heart, and he had a good imagination. There's 73 books that have the titles that he wrote. He wrote 56 in his lifetime, and all the rest he wrote after he died. No, he wrote letters, he wrote essays, and somebody brought them under common cover after his death. So I read all these books, and when I graduated from university, a person said to me, "You did not get an education in the university." And I can say to you, here at Narnia School, you're getting a good education, but you have not gotten a full education here. In America, when you graduate from university, they call that ceremony commencement, which means all you did in school was lay a foundation for your education. Now you will commence your education. And this wise man said to me, pick an author who will take you places and make that author your life study. I don't think it has to be an author. I think it could be a composer. It could be a painter. It could be a period of history. It could be a country. But something that will keep you studying for all of your days. So I picked C.S. Lewis. And I went on to graduate school, and I wrote my master's thesis on Lewis. Then I went on to do doctoral work, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Lewis. And I have read not only Lewis, but I read the books he refers to, and I found that my education really came from reading C.S. Lewis. I think the advice is good advice, and I give it to you today. Find something you're deeply interested in, and make it your life study. Something that will help you grow. And even maybe travel, because I went to travel to all the places where Lewis spent time. In Belfast, where he grew up, in Oxford, England, Cambridge, England. I went and studied all the places where he fought during World War I. It was interesting to me. And these sorts of things help us to grow. You go study someplace else, and then you want to find out more about that place, you keep growing. That's good. So I was asked to say, what would C.S. Lewis say to us today? We live in a turbulent time. When I was your age, there were not only the gangs starting in Los Angeles and difficulties, the Vietnam War was going on, people were trying to figure out what were their values. Would you go fight in the Vietnam War, or would you run away from America and go to Canada? And we were faced with all these challenges, and I think every age faces their own challenges. What would C.S. Lewis say to us in a day like this and the challenges that you have to say? Well, when somebody says to me, what would C.S. Lewis say today if he showed up? Who could ever answer that question? None of us knows the answer to that. But I can say there is something that Lewis did say that I think has value and merit for us today. He wrote a book called The Abolition of Man. And in this book, he was concerned about the loss of values in his own day. And how do you find values? How do you begin to understand even the very nature of truth? Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. To make a truth claim, there has to be something to support the claim. This is an elephant, right? No, it's a pen. There's no elephant there, so there's no reality that supports the claim. To make a true statement, I have to have a reality that supports the claim. This is a pen. Same thing with areas of ideas, not just areas of material objects like pins and chairs and walls and so on. The area of ideas, love, justice, I have to have a good definition. I have to be able to reason inferentially from that definition and build my argument and my understanding of those things. So Lewis believed there was a reality that existed independent of my thoughts about it. And he wrote this, in coming to understand anything, I must reject the facts as they are for me in favor of the facts as they are. Our tendency is to begin to project on other things what we want them to be, and we don't grow, we don't learn, we don't really discover. Everything is a projection. You have a relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, and people start to use other people because they value that person only for what that person does for them, not because they respect that person and they have an understanding that this person also has feelings. You can become self-referential and you will begin to use other people. Or you become self-aware. Other people hurt like I hurt. So therefore, I don't want to hurt anybody else. And so you become self-aware, and if you become self-aware, you become empathetic towards other people. You can begin to grow. So in one of his lectures, C.S. Lewis made this statement to his students at Oxford University. We have fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some track of reality. To see reality different than yourself and begin to get your mind and your heart and even your moral choices around that. Let me see if I can put it together for you too, because Lewis thought that this reality was full of wonder and awe, and that it had a spiritual dimension as well. He wrote one time in the last book he wrote that we look at the universe around us and we should have a sense of gratitude and also a sense of wonder. He said we could look at the world and we could say, wow, look at this world, what must God be like? I remember reading this in 1979, and I started asking the question because Voyager, the interplanetary probe that was passing Saturn, was going by at that time, and I asked Lewis this question, what must God be like? And with Saturn, it's a mysterious planet with the rings. One of the rings of Saturn they discovered at that time was braided. And I thought to myself, wow, what must God be like? No human eye had ever seen this, and God chose to braid the outer ring of Saturn. And I shared this with a friend of mine, and he said, yeah, Jerry, we don't know if he didn't just braid it for the picture. Like you might have braided a girl's hair for the picture. I think of ships that park themselves over the depths of the Pacific Ocean, greater than the light of the sun can reach, and they dangle cameras in those depths. And they take pictures of fish neon bright. Why? Why are they neon bright? Can't be to attract a mate. In fact, how do fish at those depths even get together at those depths? It's interesting to me. And here's Lewis saying, wow, look at this. I grew up in Southern California. We like to see palm trees silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. It awakened in our hearts a sense of wonder and mystery. Or a mountain range. I love to see these things. I think any person who's right thinking and right feeling would look at the night sky and you see a star twinkling in the sky. That alone should awaken wonder in the mind and heart of every right thinking, right feeling individual. And Lewis causes us to look at the world this way. But what must God be like that he has glittered the night sky with stars and moons and shooting stars and comets? And I remember seeing the Northern Lights. Have any of you ever seen them before? The greens and reds and blues and whites just dancing in the night sky. And it just takes your breath away. But what must God be like that he made delicate things like flower petals and hummingbirds and peacock feathers? My word, there's something to be enamored with. But Lewis will never let us stop there. He's too honest. What must God be like that there have been difficult things like earthquakes in Haiti, tsunamis in Japan, AIDS babies being born in Africa, or too many school shootings in America? Lewis wrote this, if our faith is objective, if there's an objective reality to it, then we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent. For it's precisely in the puzzling or repellent that we begin to discover what we didn't know before, and we get to know now. Now, Lewis also understood that the life of the imagination was important because the world is complex. And how do you increase your understanding of anything if you don't employ the imagination? Even the scientists tell us this. What's the first step of the scientific method? Hypothesis. It's not real, it's an imaginative depiction. Maybe it's like this, so we experiment. And if we discover some new truth and extend our understanding, having begun with the imagination, we then want to explain what we've discovered to others, and we use models. We depict what it's like. It's an imaginative exercise. The other thing Lewis tells us that's very important at this point is that whatever you know right now, it always will need to be modified. Modified. He made this statement: reality is iconoclastic. Reality is iconoclastic. What's an iconoclast? A person who breaks idols. I have an image of something, maybe of God, maybe of the universe, maybe even an image of myself. C.S. Lewis said, I want God, not my idea of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I even want myself, not my idea of myself. That whatever my image is, if I hold on to it too tightly, that image that maybe I understood by a class I took at the Narnia School, a book I just read, a conversation I had with a friend, pieces of the puzzle come together. That image is helpful, but if you hold on to it too tightly, it will compete against you having a growing understanding of anything. All throughout history, people who are thoughtful have written about this idea. One philosopher of religion in England, his name was Baron von Hugel, he said, beware of the first clarity, the first understanding of a thing. Press on to the second clarity and the third clarity. Keep your mind growing with wonder. Robert Browning, the poet, he said, welcome each rebuff, each difficulty that turns Earth's smoothness rough. We can think we have it all figured out. Our Earth is nice and smooth. We've got an answer for everything. But the Earth isn't smooth. It has texture. It has peaks. It has valleys. Welcome the things that help you to see it the way that it is, rather than merely the way you have to have it be. And if any of you have ever read the Narnian Chronicles, the most spiritually sensitive person in our world to go into Narnia was Lucy. And she's in Narnia. She's gotten to know Aslan, the Christ figure. She loves him. She loves burying her face in his mane. She goes back to Narnia on her second trip to Narnia. And when she sees Aslan for the first time, she exclaims, Aslan, you're bigger. He says, no, child, I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger. So consequently, because there are things that we're going to discover that cause us to recognize we need to change. Our present conceptual framework is not sufficient to handle the new data. We have to try to be wise enough to ask, in what way will we change? Will we throw out what we presently know and start all over? That would be accommodating ourselves to the new data. Or will we say, no, what we know is good, but it's not complete. So we take the new data and we assimilate it into our present understanding, and we get bigger in our understanding. And we have to decide in the midst of any kind of intellectual challenge, or any kind of heart challenge, or any kind of volitional or willful challenge. Now Lewis felt too that this adjustment to the world was not only intellectual and emotional, it was also volitional, a change of the will. That it required the development of virtue. And virtue, he saw, was an integrated whole, made up of courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. Let me talk to you about just one of these characteristics, temperance. If we have time, we may talk about more. Temperance is a habitual ability to resist the enticement of immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, though more remote, good. Temperance is a habitual ability to resist the enticement of immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, though more remote, good. When my children were little, I have 4 children. I just had my 14th grandchild born just a week ago. When my children were little, they were not temperate. They would have compromised their souls to gain sweets. They would have done anything. I can remember one time when my children, my wife was ill, so I said, I'll make dinner. And I made soup, a heavy soup with lots of chicken, and lots of noodles. I only had 3 children at that time. They were the 2 oldest, Jeremy and Alicia. And my 3rd born was still in a high chair. So I made them soup. I gave a big portion of soup to Jeremy, the oldest, a moderate portion of soup to Alicia, the middle one, and a very small portion to Grady, the smallest. I told them when they finished their soup, they could go to the icebox, the refrigerator, and they could get a popsicle, and they could eat it out on the front porch. I took a tray up to my wife, who was sick in bed, and I told her, don't worry about a thing. I fed the kids. Everything is fine. I kissed my wife. I brought her the tray of food, and I came downstairs. I hadn't been out of the kitchen more than a minute and a half. When I came downstairs, my oldest 2 kids, Jeremy and Alicia, were running out the front door with their popsicle. I thought, wow, they ate their dinner so fast. It didn't surprise me. I just assumed I made such a good dinner, see. I go into the kitchen. Jeremy's bowl is empty. Alicia's bowl is empty. But in his high chair, Grady's bowl was piled high. Those little kids just scraped their bowls right into his and went. I started worrying about this. I thought, if I'm a father, I need to teach them character. I need to teach them how to adjust their life to the world the way that it is. And therefore, how can I teach them temperance? When I would come home from work every day, my children would be there to greet me. And they would say, do you have a surprise for us, Daddy? Sometimes I would have for them a piece of penny candy. It's candy that maybe butterscotch candy that has yellow cellophane wrapper on it. And you've seen that sort of hard candy before. They'd say, Dad, do you have a surprise for us? And I would sometimes give them this candy. But one time I thought to myself, no, I'm going to do an experiment with you. I said, you can have the penny candy today, or if you refuse it today, I will take you to a toy store tomorrow and I will buy you an expensive toy. Every one of the kids looked at me and took the candy. I thought, wow, I've got my work cut out for me. So finally, there came the day when my oldest son, Jeremy, he started to realize there was a greater value in waiting for the really good thing rather than passing it up for the temporal thing that's just present. So he said, I don't want the candy, Dad, I want the toy. The other kids took the candy and looked at him, you are nuts, you're crazy. And they're not sucking on the candy and making it last, they're chomping on it, chewing it, and it goes by fast. They can't even eat the penny candy temperately. The next day I take Jeremy to the toy store, and he comes home with the toy, and the other kids look at him. They say, wow, there's a difference here. Eventually, each one of my kids started to learn that temperance is a habitual ability to resist the enticement of the immediate pleasure, to gain the greater, the more remote good. Years ago in university, I taught philosophy, and I would talk about moral development to my students, and I would talk about Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics and virtue. And all of these students, as we would talk, I would tell them stories about my children and how they compromised their temperance in order to gain they would take the immediate rather than taking the greater, the more remote good. They laughed. The students would laugh about my children and these things that they did. Then I would say to the students, how many of you are shacking up with your boyfriends and girlfriends? How many of you are unable to resist the enticement of that immediate pleasure to gain some greater, though more remote good? And all of a sudden, the students saw that the immaturity there was just like the immaturity of the children, because they couldn't resist the immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, though more remote good. Not only that, their values were so compromised, they didn't see why that was maybe a greater, though more remote good. Engendering trust in a relationship. Learning not to take and use another person. To live like that when the culture is going off the rails requires another feature of virtue. It requires courage. Courage was seen as a habitual ability to suffer pain and hardship. It's endurance. It's fortitude. It's staying power. It's the ability to do the right thing even when it's difficult to do it. When I was in college, I was playing American football. And I was wrestling, and I was involved in track and field. I had a friend who was a cross-country runner. He was a distance runner. I was in my first year of university, and he came to me and said, "Hey, we're going to run in the Palos Verdes Marathon." This is a marathon in the Los Angeles area, and it's all hills, up and down. In Chicago, they have a marathon, it's flat as a pancake. But in the Palos Verdes Marathon, it was all hills. And he said to me, "Jerry, why don't you come run with me?" I had just finished football season. American football, you put out for 6 seconds. And then you pant desperately for oxygen for 30 seconds before you run the next play. This guy was a cross-country runner. He was used to running great distances. I hadn't trained one day for the marathon. And he says, "Oh, Jerry, I'm sure you could do it. You'd be a natural." And he starts talking to me, and I start thinking, you know what? I'm going to be one of those guys who doesn't train for it at all, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to win the whole thing. Just delusional. Completely delusional. He picks me up and we go. We have to go at 5 in the morning. We get there, and it's about 6:30 in the morning, and we're getting ready. They're going to start it at 7. And I think to myself, what am I doing here? Until I saw the ABC, the national television camera crews there to film this thing. And the sports photographer from the Los Angeles Times was there. And I thought to myself, I think I can win it. I go right to the starting line. I hate to confess this, but rather than starting like this, I got down in a sprinter's start to run the miracle. 26 miles, 385 yards. The gun goes off, and you guys, I led the pack. I was in first place for about 200 yards, 200 meters. All of a sudden, I started getting a pain in my side. I thought, oh my word, I still have 26 miles, 185 more yards to go. I finished 20 miles. I couldn't walk straight for 3 weeks. I was going to kill my friend who brought me there, but I couldn't catch him. I was just so beat up. I lost all the skin on my feet. It was horrible. I hadn't trained. There are all kinds of people who forget that life is not a sprint, it's an endurance race. And we're making sprint preparations for a life that's going to take a long haul view of life rather than a short haul. There was another area of virtue, and that was justice. Justice was that recognition that my own moral development is linked to my responsibility to somebody else. Justice is the habit of securing and protecting natural rights for others. Justice seeks to be fair. And justice, to be a just person in a world where justice is compromised, requires temperance in your own life and courage as you seek to live a moral life in relationship with others. Justice. And then lastly was wisdom. Wisdom was the habit of being careful about decisions we make. It seeks counsel and advice. It recognizes all of us operate from a limited perspective, and we seek to gain from others a wider perspective. We seek to gain from books, from our education, and from our ongoing life education, greater perspective. Years ago, we used to live in England. And my kids like to go places in England where there were labyrinths. The best one was in Hampton Court. It was a maze, there was a hedge, and it was 8 feet high. You would pay to go in, and right where you paid the proprietor to go into the maze, there was a scaffolding. I couldn't understand what the scaffolding was for. But if you went into the maze and you got lost, you could cry out. And the proprietor would go up on the scaffolding, and from his elevated position, he could see you and guide you out of the maze. Wisdom is the recognition that we are people in the labyrinth of life. We need the perspective of the scaffold. And so we look for help in these areas. From other people, from other books. Even if we're living in our time, we want to gain the perspective of other time. C.S. Lewis said, we can't go forward in history. We can't go forward into the future and look back at the mistakes of our time. But we can go back in time and see that the people in the past made mistakes too, but made mistakes differently than ours. As we read about them, we can have something to compare our own time with, and we can start to develop and see the errors of our time. And in that process, as we develop, exhibit those virtues of courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. This is very important for Lewis. He writes about it in Mere Christianity. He writes about it in The Abolition of Man, and you see it developed in imaginative ways, even in his fiction. Well, we have some time for a few questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You can ask whatever you want. I'm sure Jerry knows almost everything about C.S. Lewis. So, there is the space for your questions. Your comments, your reactions. I will.
There's
yes,
one way back
there
there.
is one.
Well, while he comes up, let me say this. While he comes up, before he asks the question, let me say this. When I was young, I was an athlete. I played American football until I was 44 years old. I enjoyed it very much. I coached in America and so on. Now I'm old. I can't do those things. But I can still live the life of the mind. So now I can write books. I can do these kinds of things and explore things intellectually and academically. Every age gives you opportunity to explore in new areas. So don't be in a hurry to get to some place where you're not. Don't grieve when your youth passes and you get old. There's always fun things you get to do. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I apologize in advance for my primitive question, but this is in the, like, you said how C.S. Lewis was honest in describing the wonders and beauty, but not forgetting about the complications in life. So I have a analogical question. Sometimes atheists are asked by believers, what would make you change your mind? What would you need to see to start believing in God? My question is, what would a believer need to see to stop believing in God? Have you something like this? Like intellectually honest believer or non-believer, I think should have this settled down somehow and should know what would trigger change in his attitude.
That might not necessarily be so. You assume that if one could change because they discover something. C.S. Lewis had been an atheist. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, he was the one that convinced C.S. Lewis to come to faith. So you say, if an atheist would change, maybe the atheist discovered something that was no longer sufficient to support him in his view, so he changed. You assume then that a believer would necessarily be able to find something that would, but it's not necessarily true. How can I believe? I believe you have a microphone in your hand. What would it take to convince me that you didn't have a microphone? In other words, if there's no reality to support the claim, then I would be a fool to change. Here's the problem with atheism, I think. The atheist makes a claim that there's no possibility that God could exist. Nothing. At Harvard University, there's one library, the Widener Library. It has 19 million volumes under that one roof. Who's read them all? All of us are pea brains. We don't know very much. We don't know very much at all. The atheist is saying there's no possibility that God exists. There's no possibility that any book has ever been written that could prove it. There's no possibility that any book will ever be written in the future that would prove it. Nobody can make that claim. There's no reality that will support it. Give me an honest agnostic over a dishonest atheist any day. C.S. Lewis said negative knowledge is always harder to prove. To say there's no spider in this room, I would have to look in every nook and cranny before I could make the judgment. To say there is a spider in the room, I could see one scurrying across the floor. If the person says there is no spider, but he hasn't checked the room, and another person says no, there is a spider, how would you make the person who saw the spider believe that the spider wasn't there? You can't, because you'd be denying reality.
Okay, so that's taking it to the extreme, or maybe I haven't expressed it correctly, but so let's say that we are all kind of agnostic in the beginning, and then you tip to one side or the other side in your practical decisions. Okay, so you either act according to Christianity or not. So sometimes something makes you, okay, tip to one side, like tip to the Christianity. So is there something that would make you tip outside of Christianity, like some observation in the world, or would there be something? Can you imagine something possibly happening to you that would change your mind?
Well, it's possible that you could see a person who would claim to be a Christian and they would be acting in a very bad way. And that would be very disquieting, and you might say, I have trouble believing it if there's a person like him who could be a Christian. But Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica said, he said, I forgot the quote. My wife says my mind's like lightning, one flash, then total darkness. He said an abuse does not nullify a proper use. So if you judge anybody in the society by virtue of the worst examples of that class, then there are always bad students, bad professors, bad lawyers, bad politicians. You don't want to judge by virtue of the worst expression of that thing, but by the best expression of that thing. And it still gets down to this one thing. Let's say you have an atheist and a believer. Then put them in a room and let them discuss. If they have opposite points of view, two mutually exclusive points of view, logic tells us they can't both be right. So let them discuss and set forth their best evidence. And if they can't set forth good evidence, then why would I follow them? If they do set forth good evidence, then I need to think about, should I change my understanding because of the evidence that's there to support it? Is that fair?
Thanks, Apache. My question would be about Eagle and Child,
yes.
C.S. Lewis and his friends. As we know, C.S. Lewis was surrounded by his friends without being married for many years. He enjoyed a relationship with Tolkien, with other guys. Can you say a little bit more about it, what changed his mind and he became married? How was it with his relationship to his wife? How it happened? I know there were movies made about this, but I don't know what is Hollywood story and what's the real story.
The movie that was made about it is pretty close. C.S. Lewis never married until he was older, in his 50s. And he met a woman, and her name was Joy. She was more interested in him than he was in her initially. She even wrote poems about him before she met him. Some people said that they thought she went to England to try to entrap him. I think there might be some truth to this. But C.S. Lewis was very shy around women. His mother died when he was 9 years old. He grew up in an environment that was all boys' schools. He didn't have much relationship with women. He had some cousins, that's about it. I don't think he would have ever married had this woman not have expressed interest in him. But she was dying. She got cancer. And all of a sudden, Lewis realized as he was about ready to lose her that he loved her deeply. So he married her on her deathbed. she recovered, and he lived 3.5 of his best years of life. They had a very, very good marriage. When she died, of course, his heart was broken, but it wasn't devastated. He was just like anybody who lost a loved one, how they would struggle with grief and so on. But he made some mistakes, Lewis, because Tolkien was his good friend, and he never told Tolkien he had married Joy. How would you like it if you thought you were somebody's best friend and they got married and they didn't even tell you about it? That was a mistake. Lewis could make mistakes.
Joy was divorced, yeah, and Tolkien, as a good Catholic, was against the marriage.
She had been divorced. Her husband had committed adultery, and there was a divorce. And so they were married by virtue of that. Yeah. The other thing, too, Lewis had 2 stepsons. One of his stepsons is a very good friend of mine. And he stays with us whenever he's in Chicago. But it's kind of fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you want to know more about the story, just watch the movie Shadow of Light. Yeah? Shadow of Light. Have a nice weekend.